Thank you very much, showing up in great numbers for what's going to be, I know, a very, very interesting lecture, because I heard it about a year and a half ago in Amsterdam when I heard Professor Solms give the same or a similar presentation. We'll have to wait and see. And I thought, we need to get this guy to New York, because it was such a fascinating talk about essentially consciousness, but also psychoanalytic theories and neurobiology. And Professor Solms is an expert in this field. He's a professor of neuropsychology, in fact, in the Department of Neurology at the University of Cape Town, and where the hospital is called Grote Schuur. I mean, they pronounce it differently, but this is how it should be pronounced. And it's actually the English language university, the Afrikaner university is Stellenbosch, which you also pronounce a little bit differently. And he's been extremely productive. He's written 350 papers. He's written 8 books, and he's actually working now on this topic for the lay public that he is writing. And one of his major achievements also is doing the revised translation of the entire works of Freud, where he's been just finishing up and has been working on for the last 20 years, which is obviously, as you know, I mean, it's 24 volumes, 250 pages each, so you can imagine how big a undertaking that is. And he can do that because he's fluent in German and in English, because he grew up in a little part of South Africa where people also speak German. Has an interesting history, that part of the world. So he's been able to do that, which, you know, obviously, it's going to come out very soon. It's going to be highly recommended that you probably take a look at this revised edition of all the works, the complete works of Freud. So anyway, he's a very accomplished researcher. He's a very accomplished writer, and he's a very accomplished speaker. So I'm very glad you're here. From the UK, we've been working for 7 weeks, so not such a long trip, fortunately, for us. But thank you very much for coming here. We're very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kahn. The talk you heard me giving in Amsterdam overlaps only very slightly with what I'm going to talk about today. And in fact, Freud will hardly be mentioned. The topic, well, it's on the screen, is consciousness, and the phrase why and how consciousness arises. You will see in a moment why I'm using that phrase. And as Dr. Kahn told you, I'm busy writing a book. In fact, I've spent the last 7 weeks in splendid isolation in the English countryside. So this is my coming out of that back into the world, and I'm going to try to distill everything that I've written in that book into these, well, 45 minutes or so, which is a kind of an impossible task. So I want to start by giving you these 2 references. The work I'm doing on consciousness, I'm doing together with this chap here, Carl Friston, who's a computational neuroscientist in England with a background in physics. In fact, he is also, though, one of you. He's a psychiatrist. And that's my one excuse for talking to psychiatrists on this topic, although, as you will see, it does actually touch on what psychiatry is all about in unexpected and interesting ways. But I'm putting these 2 references here because I have to tell you in advance, it is truly impossible to answer the question why and how consciousness arises in 45 minutes. So if you're wanting to get a slightly better grip on the topic, do please read one of those 2 papers. Here's a sort of summary. Also, I should tell you that the reason that I'm wanting to talk to you on this topic, even though it's not strictly speaking psychiatry, and even though it's such a theoretical paper, is because I'm terribly excited about it. You know, I really believe, if you will forgive me, that we are pretty close to cracking what is called the hard problem of consciousness. And this is supposed to be the most difficult problem in science today. So you're my guinea pig audience. That's why it's not the same talk as I gave before, because we've made progress since then. You're my guinea pig audience in the sense that I'm going to be giving this paper in June in Interlaken at the annual consciousness. There's a thing called the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness or something like that. And they invited me to give this paper there in June. And so this is a trial run to see, is it possible to address this topic in such a short period of time? So there's a sort of a summary. I'm going to start out telling you what the hard problem of consciousness is. Then I have to say something about metaphysics. You know, it's a philosophical problem in part. One can't avoid philosophy entirely. Then I will address this question, is consciousness not a cognitive function? That might be a very bizarre question to ask, but you'll see that it has been seriously suggested that it's not. Then I will explain why this problem arises. It arises out of the fact that cognition is largely unconscious. And then I will show you why I believe we need to shift our focus toward affect. That if we're going to crack the hard problem of consciousness, we need to deal with the most elemental form of consciousness, which is affective feeling. And I think that we've been led astray in our attempts to solve this problem precisely by looking at too elaborated, specifically human cognitive forms of consciousness, and that we cast a very different light on the problem if we reduce it to its more basic forms. I'll then say something about the functions of affect, basically in relation to homeostasis, and then start in the last 2 points to go back to cognition and to address the question as to how cognition relates to affect in terms of consciousness. So that's a sort of a summary, and I'll start now with the first point, the hard problem. What is the hard problem? Well, it was formulated in a journal. In fact, this journal, the one at the top there, the Journal of Consciousness Studies, which is why we published our paper there. It was published by a philosopher named David Chalmers, and this is what he wrote. It's undeniable that some organisms are subjects of experience, but the question of how it is that these systems are subjects of experience is perplexing. Why is it that when our cognitive systems engage in visual and auditory information processing, we have visual or auditory experience? The quality of deep blue, the sensation of middle sea. How can we explain why there's something it's like to entertain a mental image or experience an emotion? It's widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of how and why it so arises. And there you have that how and why, which gives me my title. So there's the hard problem as formulated by David Chalmers in 1995. This something it is like to the quality of conscious experience. How on earth does this arise out of physical processes? So I said we have to touch on some philosophical problems, and I'm not going to obviously give you an overview of the whole thing, but I believe that the problem is so hard because of the way in which Chalmers formulates it. If you ask the question, how does subjective experience arise from physiological processing, in the sense as if physiological processing produces consciousness, you know, like the liver produces bile, then you're on a hiding to nothing. Consciousness, I don't think we should think of it as something produced by the brain, and this is the dual aspect monist philosophy that I just need to quickly introduce you to. If you look at yourself in the mirror, you see in the mirror Mark Solms, the body, and you feel yourself internally to be Mark Solms, the mind. These are two manifestations of one and the same thing. It's not the one doesn't produce the other, they're just two different perspectives on the same thing. That's Mark Solms seen from the outside. This is Mark Solms being him from the inside. They are observational perspectives. It's not a causal relationship, it's a perspectival relationship. That, of course, begs the question, then what is the underlying thing? If Mark Solms is both a body seen from the outside and a mind seen from the inside, then if these are just appearances, what is Mark Solms himself? What is the underlying monist unity? And that's where we come up not with something spooky, but with the idea of function, that there's some sort of functional organization which manifests from the outside in our physiological functioning and manifests from the inside in our psychological functioning. And what we need to do is to find one unitary explanation of these two manifestations of consciousness. That's what we're looking for, a sort of an abstraction. I can illustrate it with reference to this. These are from an optogenetic image of some amygdala neurons in a mouse that is busy experiencing fear. So this is a fear memory looked at from the outside. And then there's the mouse's actual experience from the inside. Ah, scary experience, you know. So from the outside, there you have a fear memory. And from the inside, here you have the experience of a fear memory. These are two different ways of looking at the same thing. So which one is the memory itself? These are just two perspectives on memory itself. Memory is an abstraction. We have functional accounts of memory. And the memory in question is, this pointer doesn't really, I'm not allowed to move. I must stay here, apparently. But you get it. Down there, there the pointer goes up. Over there, emotional responses. That's an abstraction. It's a certain kind of memory, fear memory. And this is a very, very high level, super simplistic, functional model of memory. But it's this kind of thing that we're looking for. We want a functional model which explains memory both in its external manifestations and in its experiential manifestations. And we have laws about memory, like Miller's law, which has to do with the size of short-term memory. You can only hold roughly 7 bits of information in mind. And you can explain that physiologically. You can experience it psychologically. These are two manifestations of one law. The same applies to Ribot's law, which has to do with the temporal gradient in forgetting and so on. There's two different ways in which you can look at the physical or psychological manifestations of memory, but what you want is a functional account, the underlying laws. So what we need is something like that in relation to consciousness. You might think, but this is why I now have to ask this question, is consciousness not a cognitive function? Because why is it so difficult? Why can't we find the function of consciousness? In other words, infer the underlying laws. Why is this such a special problem? Why don't we treat it in the same way as we do visual perception or memory or language and all the rest of cognition? Well, the reason we don't is because David Chalmers says we can't. David Chalmers says that consciousness is not a problem that can be solved with functional explanations. So I'm quoting him again, that same paper that I cited earlier, the famous paper from 1995 in which he initially formulated the hard problem of consciousness. He writes, the easy problems are easy. But that, by the way, he means correlations between brain processes and mind processes. You can correlate experiences with their physiology, but that doesn't explain how the physiology turns into an experience. And as I said, that's the wrong way of thinking about it. So he says the easy problems are easy precisely because they concern the explanation of cognitive abilities and functions. To explain a cognitive function, we need only specify a mechanism that can perform the function. The methods of cognitive science are well suited for this sort of explanation, and so are well suited to the easy problems of consciousness. By contrast, the hard problem is hard precisely because it's not a problem about the performance of functions. The problem persists even when the performance of all the relevant functions is explained. What makes the hard problem hard and almost unique, by the way, I don't know how you can say almost unique, but there you go. What makes the hard problem hard and almost unique is that it goes beyond problems about the performance of functions. To see this, note that even when we have explained the performance of all the cognitive and behavioral functions in the vicinity of experience, there may still remain a further unanswered question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? A simple explanation of the functions leaves this question open. Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? And this relates to the whole argument about philosophical zombies and so on, that you can have a machine that performs all the functions, a computerized machine, you know, there's Turing machines that perform all the functions of human cognition and pretty darn well, and increasingly these days pretty much better than us in many respects, and they're not conscious. So what does the consciousness add? The consciousness is something which isn't accounted for by the explanation of the function. The function can be performed without consciousness. This is what Chalmers is saying. And I think that there's merit to that view if you think about this fourth point, which is, in fact, cognition is not intrinsically conscious. A major discovery of the last 20 years of the 20th century, or rediscovery, if you'll forgive me for putting it that, bearing in mind I'm a psychoanalyst, was that most of our mental functions are, in fact, performed unconsciously. And most of cognition does not require consciousness. In fact, when you look at how much we can do unconsciously, in regard to cognition, it really has led seriously to the question, what on earth is the consciousness for? Because it's not clear what it adds. It's not clear that it does anything. And I'm speaking about memory and language and navigation, problem solving, all sorts of things can be done, even reading with comprehension, even recognizing a familiar face and so on. It's easy to demonstrate experimentally that all of these cognitive and cortical functions can be performed brilliantly without the experimental subject even knowing that they have experienced anything. Here's a famous review paper by Barge and Chartrand from your great city, The Unbearable Automaticity of Being, where they review the literature, the cognitive science literature, showing how our cognition is basically automatic, that it all runs its course without us necessarily having to be there. And the famous, most famous example probably is Benjamin Libet's studies, where he showed that even the celebrated free will, the decision to perform an action, is in fact preceded by cortical activity long before, 300 milliseconds before you think that you've come to the conscious decision to do this. So, as I say, in cognition, in cognitive science today, the question is very seriously asked, why do we have consciousness at all? What is it's not necessary for cognition? So it's not entirely surprising that Chalmers comes to the conclusion from studying cognition, studying these functions of cognition, that it doesn't explain consciousness, because those same functions can go on without consciousness. And I thought I would just show you one or two dramatic slides to make the point. This is a child 3 years old with a condition known as hydranencephaly, not hydrocephaly, hydranencephaly, no cortex, born like that. So she has an intact brainstem. There's little flaps of cortex there which are completely non-functional, completely glyosed. She has no cortex whatsoever, and yet she's conscious. She wakes up in the morning, she goes to sleep at night, she's conscious in that sense, but also she's reactive. She's emotionally reactive. She responds to things like in this slide here, her baby brother is put on her chest and she goes, ah, like that, you know, a happy feeling, even though she has no capacity to have any kind of cognitive image, let alone understanding of what's going on. Still, she has the feeling, still she has the conscious experience. And this is just one slide, I could show you millions, to demonstrate that these children are emotionally responsive. They are, in other words, there's conscious, intentional behavior, even though they have absolutely no cortex. So this leads me to my next point, which is that I agree with Chalmers that we can't, it is puzzling looking for the function of consciousness in relation, if our model example is a cognitive form of consciousness, and by the way, the model example in consciousness studies has been vision. The main focus has been since Crick's time on vision. Let's try and understand what's going on in the cortex when you're having conscious vision versus non-conscious vision, and then the difference between the two is the so-called neural correlate of consciousness, and then let's drill down into that, and then we'll understand what consciousness does, what it's for, and how it works, and it has been singularly unsuccessful. And I say again, the reason for that is because cognition is not an intrinsically conscious function, and cortex is not intrinsically conscious. So we're looking in the wrong place. We're looking at the wrong type of mental functioning. If we're wanting to understand consciousness, we should, in fact, rather be looking at affect than cognition. And here's the one mention of Freud. Freud, I thought, was the best person to quote in this regard, because he is, as I said, famously responsible for making us aware of how much of our mental life is unconscious, and yet even Freud says the following: "It's surely of the essence of an emotion that we should be aware of it. That is, that it should become known to consciousness. Thus, the possibility of the attribute of unconsciousness would be completely excluded as far as emotions, feelings, and affects are concerned." Now, this is not an appeal to authority. I'm just wanting to make you aware that even Freud was of the view. I could have appealed to the Oxford English Dictionary. By definition, a feeling is felt. It makes absolutely no sense to speak of this mental function called feeling without reference to consciousness. So if you're wanting to understand the elemental form, the foundational form, the basic form of consciousness, start with those mental functions which are intrinsically conscious. Don't start with those that are intrinsically unconscious. You're going to get lost. So I say this is where we start to cast an entirely different light on the problem. I think that it's entirely reasonable to ask the question, what is the function of affect? Because the function of affect has to explain why it feels like something. Unlike vision and cognition in general, which, as I say, does not necessarily have to feel like something. Feelings do have to feel like something. Everything that feelings do, they do because you feel them. So here's a slide just to remind you of something of the history of how we got this problem wrong. We thought of cortex as the organ of consciousness. This comes from classical German functional neuroanatomy of the 19th century. We thought of consciousness as streaming in through our senses, which project ultimately onto cortex. Cortex is where all of our sensory qualities reside, and so this was thought of as the organ of consciousness. If you lesion visual cortex, you lose visual consciousness. If you lesion auditory cortex, you lose auditory consciousness, and so on. But in fact, as I showed you with the hydranencephalic kids, and in fact, decorticate animals, you see the same thing. You can remove the whole of cortex, and the animal remains conscious and emotionally responsive, as do human beings. And this we knew since 1949, when Magoon and Maruzzi first identified the reticular activating system, which was a huge surprise. As I said, the standard view was that the cortex is the organ of consciousness, consciousness streams in through our senses, and yet what Magoon and Maruzzi showed was that consciousness, in fact, is an endogenous property of the brain. It's generated from deep within the centroencephalic core, as they called it, and later called the reticular activating system. Consciousness is generated in the upper brain stem. It does not fly in through your senses. And when they discovered this, they were in a bit of a tiz, because this threw everything out the window that we always understood about consciousness. And so they fudged it by drawing a distinction, which is still with us today, between what's called the level of consciousness and the contents of consciousness. So the contents were still attributed to the cortex, the qualities of consciousness, and its level, that sort of volume control switch, was attributed to the brainstem, and this was thought of in quantitative terms, like the Glasgow Coma scale. You measure how much consciousness there is out of 15, whereas what cortex does is provide the contents and the qualities of consciousness. Now, this is a nonsense. It's just not true. It's just not true that what the upper brainstem produces is only a level of consciousness, and I've already showed you the dramatic example of the hydranencephalic little girl, and I've made reference to decorticate animals. Decorticate mammals, decorticated neonates, they grow up fine. They have full-blown lives. They raise kids. It's incredible how much you can do instinctually and emotionally without cognitive consciousness, without cortex. Now, I said that I was going to touch on psychiatric matters, and this is where I touch on them. Perhaps it's easiest to make my point to you as psychiatrists by reminding you that many of your mainstream medications are, in fact, you're acting on the neuromodulatory systems, which are reticular activating system circuits. Your antipsychotics act on this circuit over here, this mesocortical mesolimbic dopaminergic system, which has its source cells here in the ventral tegmental area, part of the reticular activating system. Same applies to your antidepressants, which act on RAFE nuclei. Well, at least the source cells are in the RAFE. So you're fiddling with serotonin. You're in fact fiddling with reticular activating system. The same applies to noradrenaline, which has its source cells in the nucleus locus coeruleus complex. These things that you guys tinker with are feelings. They are states of mind. These are emotional disorders that you're treating. You're not treating levels of consciousness in a purely quantitative sense at all. So what we're talking about in terms of what the reticular activating system contributes is not just a level, it's not just quantitative, it's not just volume control, it has content and quality of its own, and this content and quality we call affect. And this, of course, is much more ancient than cortex. This is where consciousness began. And as I said, you can't speak of the feeling of an affect without it being conscious. And what Magoon and Maruzzi's studies showed us from the get-go, although they didn't know that they were talking about affect, was that this is the foundational form of consciousness in the sense that if these structures are lesioned, all consciousness goes. But it doesn't work the other way around. You can remove all of cortex, you still have consciousness. You remove the tiniest piece. In fact, in the parabrachial complex over there, you remove 2 cubic millimeters of tissue, and you have coma. So this is where consciousness comes from, and consciousness is fundamentally affective. Had I more time, I would be going into oodles of evidence about this. I've just given you, the highlights and the dramatic pictures. Of course, you all know about stimulation studies, deep brain stimulation of these structures. There was the famous study in the late 90s of the woman who had she was having deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's, and accidentally the electrode went into substantia nigra, and she went into a massive suicidal depression on the operating table, just like that, with absolutely no psychiatric history. So there's lots and lots and lots of evidence that what these structures generate is affect, not just a level of consciousness. Here are some famous PET images from Damasio showing some of the basic emotions. What you see is where all the heat is in the brainstem, in subcortical structures. Cortex, in fact, is deactivated during all manner of affective states. And here's, of course, the most dramatic example, orgasm. Orgasm is a very strong affective state, and your cortex shuts down, and you have this exquisitely qualitative feeling called orgasm, and it's not just a level. I hope you agree with me. So what we're dealing with here is affects, the foundational form of consciousness, upon which all other forms of consciousness depend. And if we want to understand how and why consciousness arises, therefore we need to understand how and why affect arises. And this makes it a much simpler problem. I'm sure you're all, I've already mentioned his name, I'm sure you're all familiar with the work of Damasio, probably done more than just about anybody else, to clarify what the role of affect is in the life of the mind. He draws attention to these red nuclei, which are body monitoring nuclei. Best known, of course, is the hypothalamus, but they're these circumventricular organs, parabrachial nucleus, already mentioned, area postrema, nucleus solitaris, and so on. These structures, which are monitoring the state of the body in relation, especially the hypothalamus, to basic homeostatic needs. In other words, we need to be maintained within very narrow ranges physiologically in relation to all sorts of bodily needs, and also emotional needs. These emotional circuits do the same sort of thing. They all are homeostatic functions. And that it's the maintaining of oneself within settling points, within preferred states, within states which are viable for our survival. This is what affect is for. So I'm coming now to the question of what is the mechanism of consciousness via the question, what is the mechanism of affect? And I've told you that affects are basically deviations from homeostatic settling points. Now, of course, we also have vegetative homeostatic functions. There are plenty of, like blood pressure is the clinically notorious example. You don't know anything about what's going on with your blood pressure, but the affect, what affect adds, is the capacity to feel your state, so that you can feel your way through a situation in terms of what you're going to do about it. So, for example, suffocation alarm, you feel it. Most of the time, your blood gases are regulated automatically, but when you're in a state of air hunger, you know all about it. And there's this intense affect, suffocation alarm, air hunger, and it says, do something. And this is what affects are for. They tell the animal, us included, you better do something, mate. If you don't get out of this state, you're gone. And the same applies to thermoregulation, the same applies to hunger, the same applies to thirst. That's what affects are for. They have an obvious function, they have an obvious place in nature, they obviously do something. They're not just fluff that's added on. And this is why I say that there's my excuse for talking to you as psychiatrists also is to remind you that what you deal with is absolutely fundamental to life. That this is what the mind is for. It's for feeling, so that we know how we're doing in relation to our basic biological needs. In states of uncertainty. So there are homeostatic functions which work automatically, and then there are those where you need to be able to feel your way through the situation, to know, is it going badly? Am I getting further from where I need to be? That's what unpleasurable feelings are. That's the red arrow. Am I getting back to where I need to be? That's pleasurable feelings. That's the blue arrow. And where you want to be is on the black line, which is your homeostatic settling point. In other words, feelings are a sort of an alarm mechanism. They're telling you that you're not where you want to be, you're not where you need to be, and you're going in the wrong direction or you're going in the right direction. This is the basic Damasio view of what affects are for, what their function is. And as I keep saying, I think this casts an entirely different light on the question of how and why consciousness arises. Now, I'm speaking about basic bodily affects, things like suffocation, alarm, thirst, hunger, and the like. But the same applies also to emotions. These are obviously not as immediately life-threatening or life-sustaining as are those bodily affects, but they function according to the same basic principles. Fear is probably a good example. Fear is there for very good biological reasons, that you feel, oh my God, I'm in danger, this predator is coming for me. And there's a prediction that's built into you as to what you need to do. What you need to do is freeze, or you need to flee. These are instinctual responses. But that's not enough. Life is far more complicated than to be dealt with just in terms of either I freeze or I flee. You need to learn from experience. And so the feeling of your way through the situation enables us to elaborate these automatic instinctual responses. And this is how all of these basic emotions work. They too are ultimately there for our survival and our reproductive success. Emotions are very important things. They do something. And you can't just say, well, like Damasio says about vision. I mean, not Damasio, sorry, Chalmers says about vision. Blue and red, these qualia of the what it is like to see. It wouldn't make any difference if you saw red where I see blue. They don't do anything. I could call it blue and you call it red. It doesn't make any difference. It's just fluff. But imagine if the same were to apply to these things. Imagine if instead of feeling fear, you feel separation distress, and then as that line's coming from you, you cry, mama, and you hug her. You'll be dead. So what emotions do, what they compel us to do, their causal consequences are easily understood within a natural scientific biological frame of reference. So I'm really zipping along quite well. Is my watch right? Is it 12:05? Excellent. Okay. So and please note the word that I used under point 6 was surprise. This is a reference to the whole computational neuroscience frame that my co-author Carl Friston works with. Surprises it means that you're moving outside of the predicted state that you need to stay in relation to these core homeostatic settling points. You need to be in that state. If you're outside of that state, it's called surprise. And the main thing is you need to minimize surprise. We have predictions as to what you need to do. And that's what I said, like freezing and fleeing are built-in predictions. And then you have to elaborate through learning from experience, what else might I do? What else might I fear? What else should I fear? What else can I do? These are predictions as to what to do to get back into that zone of comfort and survival, which in this instance is freedom from fear. But the same applies to all of the basic affects. So the feeling is a surprise. You're heading in the wrong or the right direction. That's what feelings are for. And the predictions are to remove surprise, to suppress surprise, to get you back into the homeostatically desirable state. So the point I'm leading up to is the one on the screen, my point number 7, which is that the function of cognition is to suppress surprise. That we have built-in cognitions, as it were, the reflexes and instincts and drives, but then we need to learn from experience through feeling our way through life's problems. We need to learn ways of suppressing surprise, learn ways of minimizing prediction error. So now this obviously is completely Greek, I mean literally. I'm not going to begin to be able to explain this to you. And again, I refer you to the publications that I had on the screen at the beginning. But I just want to give you the basic sort of scheme. The basic scheme is that the letter Q there on the right-hand side of the screen refers to the fact that we have internal models. We have a predictive model. We're born with our phenotype comes with a predictive model, and then you have to update this model in terms of your understanding of how to meet your needs in the world. M is the motor states, the things that we do. We have predictions as to if I do such and such, Then going to the top, the C, the sensory states, then I should feel this. That should be the consequence. So your generative model, Q on the right, leads to predictions as to what I must do in the outside world in order to have the sort of change in my sensorium that I expect. And if all goes well, then you have something like an automatic function, a function which automatically meets your needs because you've predicted what you need to do in order to get into the feeling state that you need to be in. And if all goes well, that's hunky-dory. If it doesn't, you have error. And that's what the E stands for. Error. E is prediction error. And when there's an error, that means you need to update your model. So Q is the model, E is error, and learning from experience comes from errors prediction errors, where what you do in the world doesn't lead to the outcome that you expected. The sensory outcome here I'm speaking of is feeling states fundamentally. We're talking fundamentally of feeling states. The word sensory refers to feelings. And again, remember, the big mistake that we've made in consciousness studies is to be too exteroceptive, too cognitive, too cortical about it all. The sensations that matter most to us are these life-sustaining feelings, affects that I've been talking to you about throughout this lecture. Now, precision, the omega, the bottom right of the screen, this is what the upper brainstem, this is where those neuromodulatory systems that you guys tinker with your psychopharmacological agents, they act on what in computational neuroscience is called precision. That this is just arousal, it's modulation of neurotransmitters, and this is consciousness itself. Consciousness is the feeling of your way through the updating of prediction errors as you try to meet your needs in the world. That is the function of affect. Now, these equations up here are the doing of Carl Friston. As I say, I cannot begin to explain it all to you. Read the paper, but the important thing is that it is possible to reduce how affect works to basic elemental mathematical equations, abstractions, which describe how these neuromodulatory nuclei function. It's not something mystery, it's not something outside of science, it's not something that requires us to have something spooky about consciousness. Consciousness has a place in nature, just like any other physiological function. What I wanted to say is that this business, the modulation, the precision, the omega down there, the modulation of our generative models, the thing indicated by the letter Q there, that this is what we speak of as reconsolidation. It's the activation of memory traces in order to update them. It's the rendering labile of memory traces. You could say that this is what consciousness is at the cognitive level. Consciousness is the undoing of memory, the turning of memory into consciousness, the turning of prediction into uncertainty. Consciousness is a state of uncertainty. It's the cortex in a state of flux. And as I say, reconsolidation, I'm just showing you the classical paper there to make that point. That's what cognitive consciousness is. And that leads me to my last point, which is that conscious cognition is predictive work in progress. That the feeling of your way through life's problems in the outside world is what consciousness is for. Consciousness is not intrinsically cognitive. Consciousness is intrinsically affective. It's feeling your way through life's problems, feeling your way through these attempts to meet your needs in the outside world in unpredicted contexts, in conditions of uncertainty, which makes it possible for us. You can imagine the adaptive advantages of having such a capacity to not only do by reflex, not only have automatically rote, fixed modes of response, but the capacity to be able to learn from experience is what it's all about. And I will end with this comment, which is that in the end, we have to remember that consciousness is tolerated. Conscious cognition is a bad thing. It means that you've got a problem. There's something that you don't know how to do. There's something that you need to be, it's salient because you can't predict it, because you don't know what's going to happen. It's a state of uncertainty. The ideal is to be able to learn your way, feel your way through that problem, and then if it really works well, your new solution, then you automatize it. And so declarative memory, cortical types of memory, thank God we have them for all the reasons that I've described to you, but what we are aspiring to is zombiedom. What we really want to do is not to have to feel our way through life's problems. We want to be able to meet our needs exactly as they arise, automatically and perfectly. But thank God we never really get there. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is my 45 minutes of how and why consciousness arises.
Thank you very much, Mark. This is an even better talk than I heard in Amsterdam, so I'm very glad you did this, and it's certainly more profound. Yes, Antonia.
Thank you for an interesting talk. I had a couple, I'm going to press back a little bit. So,
why am I not surprised?
okay, so Damasio's schema involves, he breaks down emotion into emotions, feelings, and feeling the feelings, right? And so emotions are really a way to perceive experience. So for your little girl with no brain, no cortex, it's the ability to see her brother and feel her brother on her chest. He calls emotions the physiologic response to that, the smile, the joy. The mentalization is her conscious appraisal of that, which you have no evidence for. And in fact, when you show Damasio's work, you don't show just the brainstem activation. In fact, you show robust activation in the posterior cingulate, which is very much part of the cortex, and in the insula, which is also very much part of the cortex. So I'm pushing back a little on the Damasio scheme. So consciousness, even if you get to emotion, doesn't necessarily get to the mentalization of that emotion, which is actually where we want to be, right?
So there are a number of points in what you've just said, and I'm going to touch on each of them. First of all, one has to acknowledge that this is a minefield of terminologies and taxonomies, and different people mean different things by these words: affect, emotion, feeling, etc. And what you say about Damasio is entirely correct. Joseph Ledoux would be another example, but Craig, perhaps even more pertinent to the points that you are making. So that's the first point, is to say different people use these terms differently. I want to be clear that I'm speaking about feeling as the raw feeling state. There doesn't have to be any understanding of what it is that you're feeling. The feeling itself has motivational power. The feeling itself has causal. The feeling is the consciousness. So having said that, though, the second point is that, of course, cortex does normally participate in normal mammalian emotion. It's not that the cortex doesn't do anything, and as I say, I'm very happy to have cortex. Cortex enables us to be able to elaborate upon these fixed rudimentary affective patterns, to be able to think your way through the problem and lay down a new memory, a new prediction. This is what memory is for. Memory is for learning how to meet my needs in the world, over and above what comes with the innate phenotypic sort of package deal. So I don't want to minimize or deny the enormous additional advantages of cortical consciousness. I need to make the point, though, that it is affective. It's driven by affect. That's what makes the cognition conscious. It's the feeling of your way through your memories or your learning or your problem solving or whatever it may be. Now, yeah. Yes, yeah, but I'm going to try and sort of stay away from the terminologies and try and get to the issue. So now the point is, if you lesion those areas that you're talking about, anterior cingulate, you can remove the anterior. In fact, it's done quite a lot in psychosurgery. You see these patients are far from unconscious. You can remove the insula. I mean, Damasio published a case of a bilateral obliteration by herpes simplex encephalitis of the insula, and it's a wonderfully comical interview with the patient, asking the patient about his feelings, and of course, yeah, he's full of feeling. And the other great, the thing that's cited by so many, Ledoux in particular, the dorsolateral frontal convexity. You can remove dorsolateral frontal convexity, as you all know, you get plenty of affect. These patients are far from being unconscious. In fact, the common denominator is you remove these cortical regions, which are so important for affect, what you get is more affect. And so what you're actually seeing is how these cortical, what their function is in fact, as I said earlier, as I said in my summary, it is in fact to regulate affect. It's in fact the managing of affect. We are wanting in fact to damp down the affect. This is what cortex adds. So although it adds something, and although it's an important part of normal conscious mentalization of affects and so on, I forget the exact term that you used, nevertheless, the essential point remains, which is that you don't need these things for consciousness. You don't need these things for affect. They are elaborations of affect. They are not fundamental ingredients of affect. And I think that our way of experiencing the thing in all of its complexity, as with all science, what we need to do is to break the thing down into its component parts, analysis, reduction, to the basic components, and then it casts the thing in a different light. But of course, you then need to add it all together again, put it all together again to get the real experiential lived life of the mind.
All right, thank you very much. Al, yeah.
Thank you for a fascinating lecture. You don't spend much time talking about the positive emotions. So let's take, for example, happiness. Seems to me happiness is a good thing. But from your model, one might say, well, happiness represents a homeostatic deviation from nirvana, and that therefore you should try to get away from happiness back to a neutral state. Can you clarify that? And what is the role of these positive emotions in this model that you provide?
Right. So the easiest way is to go back to this slide, which shows there. So the red arrow is negative affect, and the blue arrow is positive affect. The red arrow means things you're getting, you know that little game we played as kids where you blindfolded and you're trying to find somebody, so you're getting hotter, you're getting hotter, you're getting colder, you're getting colder, works like that. So it's more and more unpleasure within each one of the modalities of affect means you're heading in the wrong direction, you're getting more hungry, you're getting more thirsty, you're getting more cold. And then the pleasure of, drinking, that's what you needed. Eating, that's what you needed. A nice warm duvet, that's what I needed. That's the pleasure which says you're heading in the right direction, carry on this way, that's good. So there's plenty of room for positive affect. But even with the most extreme of positive affects, I dare I mention orgasms again, eventually it's enough already. That's called satiation. And it's the same with chocolate, even chocolate. Eventually it's like, okay. It's not that we seek, Freud made a mistake in that respect, by the way. That Freud thought there was this continuum, that the pleasure principle, we're aiming for more and more and more pleasure all the time. It's actually a homeostatic mechanism like this, it's an alternator. And what we're really aiming for is satiation. In other words, need is met, then you don't feel anything at all. So the feelings, both pleasurable and unpleasurable, say correctly, as you pointed out, that you are not in your settling point, you're not at the satiation point. But pleasurable feelings certainly have an important function, which say you're heading in the right direction. Unpleasurable. Now, there's one complication, in fact, there are many complications, but just one headline complication, which you haven't actually said, but when I'm going to put these words into your mouth, is that they are thrill-seeking and risk-taking and novelty-seeking and so on. These kinds of behaviors are very difficult to fit into this kind of simple homeostatic mechanism. And that's where it's important to recognize that the different affects work in different ways. Although they're all homeostatic, the most important one is what we call seeking. It's a sort of foraging affect, which is the default mode of our affective systems, which is that you can't just rest on your laurels. You're constantly having to be testing out new things, trying out new things, because the world is full of uncertainties. So our understanding of how that system works, this so-called brain reward system, which is a bad word for it because there's so many different types of reward. But here in that dopaminergic seeking system or foraging system, it's a matter of finding uncertainty in order to reduce it. So it's actually looking for uncertainty in order to be able to reduce it. And that's a sort of a paradoxical version of what nevertheless is the same thing. Probably the best way to think about that is that the same mechanism, except the arrows go around this side rather than around that side.
Yes, Derek.
Mark, it's great to have you here generating this conversation. And I'd like to stretch what you're saying and get you to comment on it. For a long time, there's been a gulf between the clinicians thinking in terms of the mind and the neuroscientists driving away on the circuits of the brain. And I've felt for several years now that what you're talking about here offers a bridge between those two that we don't currently have. And that if we were to pursue this more strongly, we could indeed come up with a model of the mind which bridges between those two. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, what you say is music to my ears, and I agree with every word. So I have to suppress the desire to give a whole lecture of agreement. But I would just distill it down to this one essential point, which is that I think that feelings are the bridge. Affect is the bridge. It's important for us to start with the most basic of affects to properly understand that. To remember that affect, the dawn of consciousness for me is the beginnings of a creature knowing its own state. This is not, as I said, something fluffy. And I'm putting it this way because I'm a psychoanalyst, which is even worse than a psychiatrist. But psychiatrists also, you suffer all the time from, it's not proper medicine, and, it's not real stuff, and so on. And this is why I'm wanting to emphasize this point. Affect is absolutely fundamental. It's extremely important aspect of our physiology, of our biology, of how we survive and reproduce. It is what matters. To each and every one of us. Our patients suffer from feelings, even our surgical patients suffer from feelings. Feeling is absolutely fundamental. But remember that we mustn't start with things like, even a word like happiness is a very cognitively abstracted, elaborated thing. We need to start with the most basic of affects. In order to understand the dawn of consciousness, we need to understand the biological, adaptive advantage of being able to know my state in terms of my own thermodynamics, as it were, in terms of my own entropic, am I going to dissipate and disappear, or am I going to survive? I need to stay within this narrow range. This is where I need to be if I'm not going to dissipate. Affect is, as I say, a sort of an alarm mechanism in relation to that. Then we elaborated from basic affects, basic bodily affects like pain and suffocation alarm and so on, to the emotional affects, which are also, when you think about them in the terms that I've just briefly alluded to, in terms of like fear and rage and lust and so on, separation, distress, nurture and care and so on. These things are fundamental to the survival of the creatures who are endowed with these things. Then we get these much higher cognitive elaborations of them. But that is the bridge between neuroscience and psychology, the bridge between ultimately even physics and consciousness, is understanding this. Affect is not a very complicated thing. And yet it's at the heart of both of our disciplines.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi. Thank you. That was really spectacular. So you mentioned Joe Ledoux, and him and Richard Brown and Danny Pine has produced a series of papers on the matter. And I think there are two important points that they make. One is the importance of language, and the second is the limitations of translational research. Would you care to kind of comment on those?
Yeah. So again, I think that perhaps this is the best slide to illustrate the main point I'm making in relation to that. It goes to your point also. Of course, I agree that the capacity to mentalize, to cognize your affects, to reflect upon them, to know it's me who's feeling this thing, this is what it means to me, that reminds me of the following, and it makes me project myself into the future and imagine different scenarios, and if I do this, it feels like that, and all of that happens, and as I have said repeatedly, I'm jolly glad it happens. I'm very glad we have those things, but that's really not the heart of affect. Affect doesn't require all of those things. Those are all sort of add-ons. And so when Joseph Ledoux says prefrontal cortex has to read it out, and Feldman Barrett all the more so, that she literally thinks that the naming of the affect, the labeling of it is how it comes into being, and until we give a name to the thing, it doesn't exist. And that's why I put this example on the screen. Can you not feel an orgasm without naming it? It's ridiculous. The idea that you have to have some sort of cognitive elaboration, recognition, appraisal of the affect in order for it to do its job, I think is just not true. Suffocation alarm, is another example. It's just when you have that feeling, it's absolutely obligatory to act in a certain way. The rewards and the punishments of these feelings are in and of themselves causal. Then, of course, we have cognitive elaborations of them. But the cognitive elaboration is just that. It's elaboration. It's not the fundamental thing.
All right, last question.
Thanks. So I'm particularly interested in genetics. And I'm not going to talk about the cortex. I think we can agree that consciousness is largely a brain-related phenomenon. And knowing that we know what we know now about the underlying genetics being important for the maturation, development, and function of the brain, and also explaining many complex traits, I guess, could you comment a bit about the genetic basis of consciousness or its potential role in consciousness?
Yeah. Well, the brainstem mechanisms that we're talking about, the sort of core, by the way, all of those basic emotion structures, the limbic ones, the circuits that I had on the screen earlier, all of these ultimately project down to periaqueductal gray. Absolutely every affective system projects ultimately to periaqueductal gray. So the sort of nexus, the core of our affective brain is the upper brainstem, is the midbrain. And what goes on there is really has nothing to do with learning. These are absolutely hardwired structures that they are completely the same in every single vertebrate, and they do the same thing. Then there's cognitive elaborations of that. Cortex, I mean, you forgive me for saying this, and I know I'm making an extreme statement, but to me, cortex is like random access memory space. There's really very little from the point of view of genetics that we're going to learn about cortex. The outstanding examples of this are you can remove the left hemisphere. As long as you do it young enough, everything shifts over to the right, and vice versa. These things are incredibly adaptive. There's the famous study with ferrets where you redirect the optic nerve or the optic tracts from occipital cortex to temporal cortex, and then temporal cortex sees. It just learns how to see. This is what I mean by random access memory space. So I think that the memory aspects, the learning aspects, we're talking about forebrain functions. And again, these are not things to be sneezed at. They are enormously important in terms of the flexible adaptive capacities of species who are endowed with cortex. But the basic affective mechanisms, which are upper brainstem mechanisms, really have very little to do with cognition and with learning, and you find those mechanisms in fish.
Well, very quickly then, and no quick answer.
You can help us, I think, by giving us a definition of consciousness. It seems you equate it with affective subjective experience, and it does lead me to the question of whether one is dreaming, one is conscious.
All right.
So briefly repeat the question.
No. The question is the definition of consciousness, and I've equated it with affect. And he says, what about dreaming? Is dreaming a form of consciousness? And yes, of course it is. And this is the great interest about dreams, is that it's a conscious state that punctuates the unconsciousness of sleep. And the question then arises, why do we have to become conscious while we're asleep? And if you define consciousness as I do, as fundamentally an affective function, and cognition, in conscious cognition, is an attempt to master the problem, in other words, to meet the need, to reduce, to get rid of the error. And I think that the learning process, the consolidation mechanisms of what goes on during sleep, that the reason we have to become conscious during sleep is because we're working our way through offline, as it were, through problems which have arisen during the day. And there's a lot of evidence for the view that memory consolidation is a very important part of what goes on during sleep, and in particular during dreaming sleep. So the feeling state of dreaming, I think, is fundamental to the consciousness of dreaming. The affective dimension of dreaming is fundamental to what dreaming is all about. It's working our way through problems offline, which is the safest place to do it, rather than while you're on the roof.
All right, Mark. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. I'm leaving this on the screen so that you can ask yourself that question. Can we really have affect without experience?